who finally recognized that the borders don't mean a thing. We can identify with those who are suffering elsewhere because we're in this global crisis together.
Welcome to the first ever Searching for Hope in Seasons of Uncertainty show. I'm Paul Peters. I'm going to be your host. I'm really excited that for our first episode, we have Dr. Dennis Willms from out in Ontario. Dennis, welcome here. We're really excited to have you. Few things about Dennis that I start maybe so I can do some bragging for Dennis before he does. Dennis is a medical anthropologist. He's a researcher. He's a professor. He's a father of two. He's a humanitarian, a career scientist, and he's the founding director and CEO of Salama Shield Foundation. That list could go on. That's the shortest list maybe I could make. The list could go on about who Dennis is. On top of all these things, I think what's most important to me is Dennis is a good friend. And that's what makes this special, and excited to be a part of a conversation with you. So welcome here, Dennis.
Thank you very much. You could have kept that a bit shorter. That's okay.
I could have made it longer too. Dennis, I think for me, you want to start with just giving the people the context of who are you? What makes you come alive? Who is Dennis? I mean, beyond maybe the list I've shared, there's a lot that I could go into, but who are you?
Oh gosh, well, I'm a sort of 70+ year guy who actually now lives on a farm, which I'm very happy to be on, especially at this time because self-isolation isn't that difficult because I can move from the house to the barn to the office and walk the fields, and so it's really quite invigorating out here. But besides that, yeah, I'm happily married. I've got two sons, Luke and Mark, who do interesting things. They bring me joy. Yes, I've now in what could be called professionally retirement. It really isn't because I've not been at the university for about 15 years now, but still actually busier than ever managing a foundation, Salama Shield Foundation, as Paul referred to it, as you referred to it, Paul, that takes up most of my time. So I spend many hours each day thinking about, wondering about how our staff actually in Uganda currently, there's about 30 of them now, all Ugandan. I'm the only Mzungu or a Westerner on the list of persons involved right now. And they're involved, if you will, in continuing with HIV/AIDS prevention work, but also microfinance, food security. It's an interesting story. That brings me joy. I don't get paid for this, of course. This is just a volunteer thing, but be that as it may, it does allow me to sort of continue with some of the academic roots I had at the university in terms of research and so on, and how we translate into what we know scientifically into action that makes a difference for people who are at risk and vulnerable. Originally, that was for me HIV/AIDS related, and I can tell you about that a bit later. But now, currently, even with the continuing risk for HIV, especially for vulnerable youth, where they can get a bit complacent because now you can live longer with ARVs and ARTs and so on, it's a bit different now, a different reality. But so we're still using our heads, our minds to create new opportunities for youth, and that keeps me, in spite of the seriousness of it, that does bring me joy.
Bring you back. I'd like take yourself back to when you were, maybe even when you were in high school. I'm curious, did you ever dream of, were you dreaming of working as a medical anthropologist or working in Sub-Saharan Africa? How did you end up in Lyantonde being one of the core places that you spent a lot of your time?
Oh boy, that's a long story, but I can try to keep it brief. Yeah, well, when I was growing up, and I grew up in, and you would be familiar with this, I grew up in a Mennonite family, very sort of fundamentalist Christian family. So I wanted to be a missionary, I wanted to be a medical missionary doctor kind of thing. Then I got to university and I was going to go into medicine, and I just didn't quite get into the business of medicine because I was inspired by an anthropologist, Paul Hebert. He was actually an anthropologist, but also a missionary in India. And so the anthropology bit became really kind of front and center for me, but the medical part still became really important to me. And so I veered into anthropology, and then of course did my PhD in medical anthropology, trained with the best of them. Anyway, I ended up at McMaster University. An interesting story how things do happen to you. I was recruited by the Rockefeller Foundation to be the first anthropologist at McMaster University in Department of Clinical Epidemiology and Biostatistics. And one of our students was a young African Ugandan called Nelson Sewankambo, and he had diagnosed the first case of HIV in Uganda. When at the time, the only reporting in the medical journals was of AIDS occurring, in the gay populations of New York and San Francisco and so on. He says, this is not my population, which was, he believed was predominantly heterosexual. He comes to my office and says, can you help me figure out what's happening? Why my people are at risk for this thing called HIV? And I looked at him and I was sort of like goosebumps all over. Well, what began then, that just goes back now almost 35 years, was a long history of partnership and research with him. And so we got research funding initially from the International Development Research Center in Ottawa. And we started to look at what were called the behavioral determinants of risk for HIV transmission.
I feel like in your early career, and I mean, you're a head guy in many ways. You're incredibly intelligent. You love academics.
Yeah.
Don't shake your head. You know you do.
I do.
You're incredibly intelligent. You're someone I really respect. I feel like I glean wisdom every time I talk to you. But it feels like, was it maybe in that meeting with this young youth from Uganda, or this young adult from Uganda, I feel like in some ways your work transitioned from head work to heart work. I feel like in some ways your heart took over, and I'm curious, you've named it in some of your writing, this feeling of hopelessness in Lyantonde, or despair, or this challenge that an existential agony.
Yeah. Okay.
What was it that grasped your heart to say that this is now beyond just trying to research? This is actually now, I have to commit myself to being a part of this journey.
There certainly was. What an interesting question, Paul. I mean, only you could ask such a question and actually recognize and know that, or identify that. Sure. I mean, when you're in the academy, and let's say in the university, you're conducting research. So we were able to get, I've done the numbers. I mean, it's, almost $20 million of research grants to figure out the problem. That's a lot of money for diagnosing, identifying, publishing about the problem, right? I said at that time, this was 1992, I can't keep going after these grants that in fact just find out what's wrong. I've got to go after grants that figure out how we're going to get out of this situation. And I started the foundation at that time. And that was about hope with a plan. Something so simple as, yeah, you talk your head off about having hope. Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. You should just be more positive, my friend, right? As opposed to, how are you going to become positive in a nurturing, caring, relational way? And so we realized, and I'm talking too much, aren't I? But we realized that in fact, what was disintegrating in the context of HIV/AIDS was the moral bonds that kept the society alive, like the mentors. In the African context, the moral bonds of community is predicated, it derives a lot from the relationships that young people have with old people, the mentoring relationship. I'm equipped to sort of survive and to find hope by virtue of the relationship I have with this other person who's an uncle. It's a mentoring part. Young people today, they have mentors, maybe, I'm not sure. But I mean, I think it's one piece of information we can learn from the African is that piece is critical. Okay. So your kids, you have 2 boys, beautiful boys, right? Now, when they grow up and they want to learn about stuff that's important to them, especially stuff that they don't want to talk to their dad about, who are they going to talk to about those things, like sex and so on? Well, they're not going to talk to you, I don't think, maybe, unless you're so enlightened that you're beyond reproach when it comes to, being that embracive of responding to your kid's needs. They might go to someone else that they can trust, right? But in the context of that hopelessness despair I talked about, which is that critical turning point for me, where science, the head sort of was informed by the heart, to get back to your point, it had to go from sort of science to ethics, science to kind of moral issues, and so on and so forth. And it was really, okay, what about that? Well, the basis of that is really in human relations. In human relations, we can't do this alone, right? And that has to do with the whole mentoring thing. So we revitalized the mentorship program. And it's been successful to this day. And it's a very simple, elegant, moral algorithm, really, because, I mean, it's sort of like, oh my goodness, HIV/AIDS prevention, you can make a difference if you sort of strengthen those relationships, because those guys start to talk to you about how to keep yourself safe. But if that institution no longer survives, there's no one to tell you this is what you should do to stay safe or to stay alive or to even find hope. See what I'm saying? Does that make sense?
Powerful.
Okay.
Very powerful.
I could go on, but let's just stop there for a minute.
If you don't mind, I'm going to take a little pivot here. And you talked about Ubuntu. I mean, Ubuntu it's a powerful, is it a proverb maybe, or it's just a way of life, I think is what it is. I mean, it's found in many different areas within Africa as well. There's different words for this idea that I am because we are, which is such a powerful reminder. I'm curious, and if you don't want to go here, that's okay. It's an interesting transition. You, in your later years, I want to say this is only 3 or 4 years ago, went through a period where you didn't know how many months you had left because of liver disease. And so I'm curious, what was it that gave you hope in that moment and hope through that time? And was there is there a sense of Ubuntu, of the people around you, that gave you that strength? Or what gave you hope through that season? It was a very personal season for you. That became different. Like, you're someone, your heart is always caring for the next person. You're always thinking about, like you said, you're always thinking about Lyantonde. You're not thinking about Dennis. You don't do a whole lot of time thinking about Dennis. And that's something that's so powerful about you. I'm curious, you were forced at a time to think about Dennis. You were forced to think about your own mortality, your own sense of being. And so I'm curious how you found hope. Did you learn from Ubuntu? Did you learn from experiences in Lyantonde? Did that give you hope that you maybe didn't know you had?
Well, I think, when you're faced with a critical health concern yourself personally, and you're even faced with the notion that maybe you're not going to live for a week or 2 or 3, and it's a great unknown. I mean, where do you find your strength, of course? So I think what happened to me, of course, was you realize that that there are others who deeply care for you and who are really there for you. And you realize that your community is really, is your wife and your kids and your family, and others do sort of look at you. But at the same time, of course, these are really, really critical moments where you start to ask yourself, well, what's going to be, what's your legacy? Was this a waste of time? What I found happening to me, which I think gave me some sort of sense of hope, was just the notion, and I think I did the best I can. It was a pretty good ride. I was very fortunate in many ways to be able to be in environments, work with people, with different scholars, with different really very interesting people, addressing very important challenges in my current history And that had been that whole sort of series of decades that spanned the beginning of the HIV/AIDS crisis to the point now where, in fact, there is a solution to that. I mean, people are able to live with these therapies for a good life. So I felt, I felt I felt I'd made my bit. I did okay, I guess. I wasn't going nuts about it, but I said, okay, I did the best I could. I could have done more, sure. But what it's done for me now that I've come through that, is it's given me, I have this urgency about time and about work and about what I do. And it's sort of like, how am I going to give back now? Because someone has given to me. I mean, so I have a life, because someone died. And that is that's a really interesting thing. And so sort of looking at, if you will, the whole business of how do I, every encounter I have with a friend is now sort of deliberately looking them in the eyes and seeing something different in them that I might not have recognized before. You know what I'm saying? It's every word that comes out of my mouth has to be pretty carefully chosen. I don't mess around anymore with small talk. Like I'm not special. I'm not, it's just that I have this in the back of my mind, this sense of don't waste today, Dennis, because today could be your last day. And today, and so I draw from these deep places of not just the stories, but just the wisdom of the elders sort of, coming through to me, people I've read, different influences in your life. And so all this stuff gets sort of cathected, if you will, into sort of the storyline, which is my storyline now. I'm hoping that it's not going to be stupid, and it's going to make sense, and that it's going to inspire. I'm all about inspiration, It's sort of like in the context now of COVID-19, where a lot of people are confined to small spaces, and well, all right, what's going to inspire you? Well, let me think. Sir Paul Smith, I mean, he happens to be a designer, in the UK. I like his stuff. Bit of a weird duck, but that's what makes him interesting as an individual. I mean, he says, listen, be inspired by what you see around you. Be inspired by what you see around you. And if you're not, look again. And I think that's what I would want to say to young people today and to anyone today is, okay, so here we are sort of self-isolating, and here we are very much alone with people that, are starting to wear on us, because it's sort of like, it's way too familiar. I mean, I go to work because, some might say, to get away from the people I live with. And that's why I can keep my marriage together, because I can have an office outside of the home. And all of a sudden now you're at home and you're dealing with all this stuff. And you say, where's the inspiration? Well, it requires a lot of patience, but it also requires a lot of rethinking about what is in fact important. So all of a sudden we're seeing and recognizing in the other, very Ubuntu kind of thing, stuff we might not have seen before. I mean, I've recognized in my wife, for example, gifts that I just took for granted, but I know she has. I mean, just how she manages to cope with the likes of me, how she manages to sort of be such an advisor and counselor and mother to her sons, how she nourishes others, not just herself. All of a sudden I say, I'm inspired by the fact that there are people who can do this, and I'm not doing that as good as she is. So all this intimacy stuff turns into kind of inspirations that in fact make a difference. So to get back to your point, I mean, it's, turning point. There is a different way, a different lens now that I view the world because of this thing that happened to me. And it's also reflecting actually quite differently on the writing I do, on the work I do with the foundation. It's like I'm concentrating. I don't know if you want to hear this, but I'm concentrating more on identifying individuals who I refer to as moral entrepreneurs. Now, I could define that if you like, but I mean, essentially, it's kind of an important notion for me because it gets back to that original notion of, okay, what keeps us all hopeful and keeps us going in community and society? And it has a lot to do with certain kinds of persons who are not just persons, they're individuals. Persons just fulfill all the social requirements. I mean, everyone we know, a lot of people we know are simply persons. It's like they're doing everything right, you know. They're very good citizens. They're very good at keeping their accounts safe. They're very good at managing all their affairs, but they're not individuals. In other words, they're not making anything new happen in the context, if you will, of a world that in fact requires change. So I would indeed inspire, I'd want to sort of say to young people who are so situated now where they're saying, what am I going to do with my time alone here? Affect change in small ways. See around you stuff that inspires you to say something different. Be different. Don't just be the same as you were. Use this as a kind of an opportunity to grow. Write poetry, paint something, write an opera. Start some sort of chat room where in fact you're talking about important stuff, not silly stuff, not stupid stuff, talking about how you in fact can sort of, and by the way, to borrow from the African Ubuntu bit, maybe identify an older person who's alone, who needs to just a phone call to say, you know, I've been thinking about you. Something you'd never do when you're so busy socially in high school or in college. You know that person is there alone, and you say, oh, they're alone. They must be very sad. Well, do something about it. Make a plan. Call them up. Takes 5 minutes saying, I'm thinking about you. By the way, you got something to tell me today that's important for me to know? By the way, what I want you to know is that I'm thinking about you. And it's kind of important because you've always meant this to me in the past, kind of thing. So you're finding inspirational, energetic, and morally imaginative ways to somehow say, we're going to restructure how we relate to each other in our isolation. It could be the spawn of something really quite encouraging and quite remarkable, because we know in the past, historically, that remarkable things came from people who in fact were isolated in context of great conflict and great suffering. How many years was Mandela in a prison by himself? 27, I think, if I'm not mistaken. He came out not a bitter man. He came out someone who, in fact, wanted to reconcile the races. Well, give me a break. Do you think any average person would have been doing that? It would have been just like all out revenge, right? He found a way to make peace, right? What does Anne Frank do in that attic? She writes. Do you think that was easy? Agonizing, isolating, incredibly troubling time. Found a way to hope. Frankl, the same thing, right? In that instance, it was like a very deep sense of who God was for him in getting through this great suffering, this great incarceration. We know all these stories. We've got many stories to tell of this. People who have their own demons, have their own degree of existential suffering, who in fact find a way to say, okay, that can wear me down. That's gonna really define who I am. I'm depressed. I've got all these problems. Or the person who's has every reason to be depressed says, I'm going to have a reason to somehow inspire and create a difference for others. And I'm going to express all of that in ways that, in fact, demonstrate that I have hope that we're going to get through this together. And that is, in fact, a worthy personal and individual cause. And I think it's also kind of a moral imperative. I think we really are charged to somehow become that. As you say, Paul, I think the Ubuntu philosophy can inform how we live, even in the Canadian context. Most definitely, because that's the other thing. I mean, if there's any, I hear all kinds of current stories about, what this is going to do for us as a society, right? Okay, it's going to wear us all down. Depression rates are going to go up. Divorce rates are going to go up, and on and on and on, right? Or you could say, you could see the other side of it and say, but can you imagine all the hopeful signs there are in terms of how people restructure their relationships with others, right? Who finally recognize that the borders don't mean a thing. We can identify with those who are suffering elsewhere because we're in this global crisis together. Sorry.
Just one inspiring bit after another, Dennis.
Hardly. Anyway.
Oh, I appreciate it. I mean, I had all kinds of other ways I think we could go, but I feel like you've already said so much that we can sit with, that can inspire us, and hopefully inspire anyone who watches this. I have two, maybe make these the closing questions or closing statements, maybe to wrap it up.
Okay.
You, in many ways, we've talked about the fact that, or I have, and I mean, you've named some of the things that maybe create a bit of a legacy for you. There are things that, whether it's pieces you've published, whether it's research you've completed, whether it's the inspiration and impact you've had on the people of Lyantonde or in Malawi or Zimbabwe or Lesotho or wherever that might be, or in Kitchener or Waterloo. Those are all great and exciting, and I think are part of your legacy. I may be curious if you might choose in only a few sentences, if you could choose in maybe a sentence or two, Dennis, this will be tough for you, but I'm going to make you do it. How would you choose people remember you? How do you want to be remembered? What's that legacy? If the first thing people think of when they hear Dennis Willms, what do you want them to hear?
Well, I'd want them to say he did his best kicking at the can. I mean, he, like all of us, I mean, he tried his best to make a difference, to make things better. He really did recognize the plight of others in need, not just locally, but globally. He started something that, in fact, has made an impact on the lives of, and I'd say this with great humility because it just happened. But with our microfinance program, for example, and with our HIV/AIDS program with Salama Shield, we have like 3,000 women who have received loans. All of those women were impoverished when they received a loan from us because they couldn't get a loan from the bank. If you average out that each of those women has about 8 to 10 dependents, you can do the math. I mean, you can see that a lot of people, maybe 30,000 people, were affected by our ability to somehow give them a heads up, to give them a leg up with a very small loan of $100, let's say. And they turn it around. And in their communities, they're what I call their base communities. They're base community groups, all made up, by the way, of very diverse elements in terms of faith and their relationship with each other. They're not necessarily related. So you got a base community group, and we have, I don't know, over 150 in Uganda. Each one of them, there's about 8 to 10 on average per group. You got Christians, you got Muslims, you got people from African traditional religion, you've got people who are just as different as night and day. What brings them together is their common humanity and their common need and the fact that all of them have something in common. I have to take care of my kids. I want to feed my kids. I want to get my kids through school. I want them not to have the miserable life I had, maybe maybe having, sorry, maybe having been a part of that will be a memory. I don't know.
Oh, thank you.
Other than that, it was kind of fun to be around. I don't know. I just don't know. That's a hard question, man. I mean, I don't know.
Oh, I recognize that's a tough question. I appreciate it. Last question. What advice, and maybe you've already done this in some way, what advice do you have someone who's looking for hope in this season that feels so uncertain? You've been through many seasons of uncertainty. What's that simple piece of advice you might give them?
I think you have to create for yourself a notion of what that hope will look like. Okay, you're envisioning and imagining an end to this, and there will be an end to this. There always has been in the cycle of history. We've had world wars, we've had periods of depression, we've had in historical periods of time, the Spanish flu, for example, or the Dark Ages and so on and so forth. You've got all kinds of periods in history where it wasn't reported and is available in the collective minds of people as it is today. So we know what's going on. I would say that you need to just recognize that there is an end to this, and there will be. Epidemiologically, these things exhaust themselves eventually, whether it's weeks or months. I'm not going to give you the science on that with COVID-19, but I'm going to say there will be a resolution to this. It will be a painful one, but it'll happen. And use this opportunity, if you will, to sort of, in small ways, when I say hope with a plan, in small ways, incremental steps every day, find new structures for, in fact, making your day a meaningful day, a productive day, an inspiring day. Treat those around you with respect, be helpful, be caring, and find some content, but do so in a deliberate way. I mean, these are choices you have to make. This doesn't come automatically. You have to sort of sit down and say, okay, I will choose to be positive in the midst of all this. I will make a plan behaviorally in terms of the action steps I make each day to somehow recognize that this isn't being a waste of time. This is not time out, like I'm being disciplined and something. This is time for making good change, okay? This is not a punishment, though it may seem that way in the isolation as something that in fact is like, oh my goodness, I'm being told to do something I don't want to do. I'd like to be out there. Use it, turn it around, turn everything on its head and say, okay, this is an opportunity for good things to happen with those around me who I love and who care for me too, and so on. And I will find other ways, if you will, to somehow bring hope to others, because we're going to get through this. Right? And part of that is not just talking like I'm talking now. Part of that is sort of, just having that can be embodied, but give it a physical element. Create something, write something down, paint something, do something, and then evaluate what that small step was in terms of what it meant for others and what it did for you in terms of the hope garnered, right? Hope with a plan, make a plan. And the plan is, it's a time of great uncertainty. There's no question about that. And uncertainty, especially when it comes to something that we know more about, but not as much about as we'd like to know. Let me just tell you another story. At the time I started my work in Uganda, at the height of the pandemic at that time, and the epicenter of this was Lyantonde district where I work globally in terms of the numbers, incidence and prevalence, right? It was a great unknown. the mystery of what's going on. But as soon as it was named for what it was, things got a little bit better. And the science helped know more each day in terms of what's going on here, how it's transmitted, what it's about, what it can do, how it can affect you, how you can reduce the risk, and all that sort of stuff. Well, it's not the same, but there are similarities in terms of the uncertainty and the unknown, the mystery of it, right? But each day we're learning more about what this thing is, right? And the more we know, the more we can can claim some understanding of what we should be doing properly, right? Learn it, read about it, how it works, right? But read each other in another way in terms of how you cope, because it's both things, right? There's both things happening here. It's very interesting that this chief medical officer of Health for Canada says, make sure you take care of yourself so you can care for others, right? She's imploring almost a kind of an Ubuntu kind of element. I mean, she's saying at the end of the day, to prevent this thing even spreading further, we better resurrect the notion of how we care for each other, safeguard each other's health, that sort of thing, right? So I would say there is hope. There is, to answer your question in a roundabout way, we will get through this.
Well, Dennis, I have to say we've gone all kinds of places I never thought we'd get to, and I'm going to even I have to take in just what we've talked about, and it's inspiring me in ways to think about what my day-to-day looks like in this season of being stuck in my house, and how I'm going to continue to get creative. And so thanks for joining us. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to being able to share this story with others. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, for this, and Zach, and we'll be in touch, huh? And you guys have a great day.